The Tigers are advancing on the left flank. We must have artillery support immediately. We cannot hold this position.
At 11:42 on the morning of May 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith cranked open the armoured hatch of his ball turret and climbed into a B-17 fuselage that was already on fire. 31 years old, 0 combat missions, 6 weeks of being told he was the worst airman in the entire squadron. 15 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters had found them over Brest, France, and they were methodically destroying every bomber in the formation. This was the spring of 1943, and the 8th Air Force was learning a brutal lesson over occupied Europe. The average B-17 crew had a 50% chance of surviving their 25-mission tour. Some bomb groups were losing that many in a single month. The submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire had earned a nickname among American air crews. They called it Flak City. On this particular mission, 78 flying fortresses had taken off from England that morning. Only 29 would drop their bombs on target. 7 would never come home. 75 young. Americans would be listed as killed or missing before sunset. Staff Sergeant Smith was supposed to be one of those statistics. Everyone at Thurley Airfield expected it, not because the mission was dangerous. Every mission was dangerous. They expected it because Maynard Smith was, by universal agreement, the most useless soldier in the 306th Bomb Group. The nickname came first, Snuffy. Like the lazy, scheming hillbilly from the comic strips, it fit perfectly. Smith was 31 in a knee. His personnel file grew thick with disciplinary actions. The men of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron had a simple policy regarding Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. Nobody wanted to fly with him. For 6 weeks, Smith sat on the ground while other crews flew mission after mission. Pilots specifically requested that he not be assigned to their aircraft. When a crew needed a replacement ball turret gunner, they asked for anyone else. The ball turret was the most claustrophobic position on the B-17, a plexiglass and steel sphere hanging beneath the fuselage, barely large enough for a small man to curl into a fetal position. 2 50-caliber machine guns, a computing gun sight, and nothing between the gunner and 30,000 feet of empty air except a few inches of aluminum and glass. Smith was short, 5'4", and physically perfect for the position. In every other way, he was considered a liability. The men who had to trust their lives to their crewmates did not trust Maynard Smith. The morning of May 1st, that changed. A crew was short 1 gunner. There were no other replacements available. For the first time in 6 weeks, Staff Sergeant Smith climbed into a B-17. The aircraft was piloted by Captain Lewis P. Johnson, Jr., a veteran completing his 25th and final mission. After today, Johnson was going home. He had survived the most dangerous assignment in the American military. One more mission stood between him and the safety of the United States. Smith had no idea what combat looked like. He had trained on fixed targets. He had memorized procedures, but he had never seen a German fighter diving at him with cannons blazing. He had never watched a B-17 explode in mid-air. He had never smelled burning flesh at 25,000 feet. He was about to learn all of it in a single afternoon. If you want to see how Smith's first mission turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more viewers. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Smith. The formation crossed the French coast on the return flight. The navigator made a fatal error. He mistook the Brittany Peninsula for the southern coast of England. Captain Johnson began descending through the clouds, believing they were almost home. They broke through the cloud cover at 2,000 feet. Directly below them was the heavily fortified city of Brest. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire immediately. Then the fighters came. Focke-Wulf 190s, 15 to 20 of them. The B-17 shuddered as cannon shells ripped through the fuselage. The left-wing fuel tank ruptured. Aviation gasoline poured into the radio compartment and ignited. The oxygen system exploded, and Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, the airman nobody wanted, found himself staring at a choice that would define the rest of his life. 3 crewmen were already gone. They had jumped from the burning aircraft, preferring the uncertainty of a parachute over the certainty of fire. The tail gunner was wounded and trapped. The waist was an inferno. Every instinct said to follow the others out the door. Smith looked at the flames. He looked at the emergency exit. Then he started moving toward the fire. The interior of a B-17 waist section measured roughly 14 feet long and 6 feet wide. In normal conditions, it was cramped but functional. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows on either side, manning 50 caliber machine guns on flexible mounts. The radio compartment sat forward. The tail section extended aft. A narrow crawlway connected the waist to the ball turret below. None of those conditions were normal anymore. Aviation gasoline burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degree irons. When the fuel tank ruptured above the radio compartment, the liquid sprayed across equipment, ammunition boxes, and the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. The fire spread in seconds. Flames climbed the walls. Smoke filled the confined space with toxic fumes. The temperature inside the waist section began rising toward levels that would melt human skin on contact. Smith had no firefighting equipment. The B-17 carried small extinguishers, but they were designed for electrical fires, not burning aviation fuel. The standard procedure for an uncontrollable aircraft fire was simple: get out. Every airman knew the mathematics of survival. A burning bomber at 2,000 feet gave a crew perhaps 90 seconds to evacuate before structural failure. Parachutes worked. Staying aboard a burning aircraft did not. 3 men had already made that calculation. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, waist gunner Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard, waist gunner Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukovich. They had gone out the door into the sky over occupied France. Their parachutes opened. German soldiers watched them descend. None of the 3 would survive the day. Smith did not know their fate. He only knew that the fire was spreading, and the tail gunner was still aboard. Sergeant Roy Gibson had taken shrapnel wounds during the initial fighter attack. He was trapped in the tail section, unable to move forward through the flames. If the fire reached the tail, Gibson would burn alive. If the fire reached the oxygen tanks, the entire aircraft would explode. If the fire weakened the fuselage structure, the B-17 would break apart in flight. Smith grabbed the first thing he could find: a blanket. He beat at the flames with it until the blanket caught fire and he had to throw it away. He found a piece of canvas and tried again. Same result. The gasoline-fed fire was too hot, too fast, spreading across too wide an area. The ammunition began cooking off. 50 caliber rounds stacked in metal boxes along the waist section walls. As the temperature rose, the brass casings expanded. The powder charges ignited. Bullets began firing in random directions, ricocheting off the interior surfaces of the aircraft. Smith was now fighting a fire while live ammunition exploded around him. He made a decision that violated every safety protocol in the Army Air Force's manual. The 50 caliber rounds were feeding the chaos. Every box that cooked off created new shrapnel, new fires, new dangers. Smith began picking up the ammunition boxes with his bare hands. The metal was hot enough to sear flesh. He carried them to the waist gun windows and threw them out of the aircraft. Box after box. His hands blistered. The skin cracked and bled. He kept working. Between ammunition runs, he returned to fighting the fire. He had discovered that the only liquid available was the relief tube. The crew urinated into a funnel connected to a tube that vented outside the aircraft. Smith disconnected the tube and used the contents to douse the flames. When that ran out, he found a fire extinguisher and emptied it. When that ran out, he urinated directly on the burning surfaces. The Focke-Wulfs had not finished. German fighter pilots could see the smoke trailing from the crippled bomber. They knew a damaged aircraft was an easy kill. They came in for repeated attack runs, cannon shells punching through the aluminum skin, adding new holes to a fuselage already perforated by flak and fire. Each pass forced Smith to abandon firefighting and man the waist guns. He had never fired at an enemy aircraft. His training had involved stationary targets and classroom instruction. Now he was swinging a 50 caliber machine gun at fighters diving past at over 300 mm, squeezing the trigger in short bursts, trying to fill the air with enough lead to discourage another attack. Then he went back to the fire, then back to the guns, then back to the fire. For 90 minutes, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith performed a one-man firefighting and defensive operation that should have been physically impossible. The man who had spent 6 weeks being told he was worthless was now the only thing standing between 6 surviving crewmen and certain death. Captain Johnson fought to keep the aircraft airborne. The controls were damaged. Several vital cables had been severed by cannon fire. The aircraft wanted to dive, to roll, to do anything except fly straight and level. Johnson wrestled with the yoke, coaxing every possible mile out of a machine that was dying around him. They needed to reach England. They needed to find an airfield. They needed to land before the fuselage burned through completely. Behind him, in the smoke and flame and chaos of the waist section, Smith had finally gained the upper hand. The fire was dying. The ammunition was gone. The tail gunner was still alive. But the English coast was still miles away, and the B-17 was held together by little more than faith and aluminum fragments. The English Channel stretched below them like a grey metal plate, cold, flat, unforgiving. A B-17 that went down in those waters gave its crew approximately 4 minutes before hypothermia set in. Rescue was possible, but unlikely. The Channel had already swallowed hundreds of American airmen in the first months of 1943. Captain Johnson could see the fuel gauges dropping. The ruptured tank had dumped most of their reserve over France. What remained was barely enough to reach the English coast. Maybe, if the headwind stayed light, if the remaining engines held together, if the fire-weakened fuselage did not tear itself apart from the aerodynamic stresses of flight. Behind him, Smith had won his battle. The flames were out. Charred metal and melted wiring covered the waist section floor. The smell of burned rubber and aviation fuel saturated every surface. But the fire was dead, killed by 90 minutes of desperate improvisation by a man who had never been trained for anything like this. Smith crawled aft to check on the tail gunner. Sergeant Roy Gibson was conscious but badly wounded. Shrapnel had torn through his legs and torso during the initial fighter attack. He had been trapped in the tail section throughout the fire, unable to move forward, unable to help, able only to wait and hope that the flames would not reach him. Smith administered first aid with the aircraft's emergency kit. He bandaged the wounds as best he could. He made Gibson as comfortable as possible in the cramped tail compartment. Then he returned to the waist section and manned the guns again, watching for any German fighters that might have followed them over the Channel. None came. The Focke-Wulfs had turned back at the French coast, unwilling to venture over open water where British Spitfires patrolled. The crippled B-17 limped toward England alone, trailing smoke from a dozen holes in its aluminum skin. The coast of Cornwall appeared through the haze. Johnson began looking for any flat surface long enough to land. A 4-engine bomber. The normal procedure would be to return to Thurley, their home base in Bedfordshire. That was impossible. The aircraft would never survive another 200 miles of flight. They needed to land immediately. RAF Predonac sat on the southwestern tip of England, a grass airfield originally built for coastal defence fighters. The runway was short by B-17 standards. The facilities were minimal, but it was flat, it was close, and it was their only option. Johnson lined up his approach. The landing gear extended. 3 green lights confirmed the wheels were down and locked. He reduced power and let the battered aircraft sink toward the grass strip. The touchdown was smooth. Johnson had flown 25 missions and survived everything the Luftwaffe could throw at him. He knew how to land a damaged bomber. The wheels touched, the aircraft rolled, and for a moment it seemed like the ordeal was finally over. Then the fuselage cracked. The fire had done more damage than anyone realized. The aluminum skin had lost its structural integrity in the area around the radio compartment. The stress of landing, the weight of the aircraft settling onto its wheels, was more than the weakened metal could bear. The B-17 broke in half just behind the wing root. The nose section slid forward, the tail section ground to a halt separately. Rescue crews who had been waiting at the edge of the runway sprinted toward the wreckage, expecting to find bodies. What they found instead was Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith climbing out of the shattered fuselage, his hands wrapped in bloody bandages, his flight suit covered in soot and burns, helping a wounded tail gunner to safety. Ground crews counted the holes later. 3,500 individual penetrations from bullets, cannon shells, and shrapnel fragments. The aircraft had absorbed more damage than any B-17 they had ever seen. The fact that it had remained airborne long enough to reach England defied every engineering calculation. Captain Johnson wrote his mission report that evening. His assessment of Staff Sergeant Smith was unequivocal. The ball turret gunner's actions were solely responsible for the safe return of the aircraft and the lives of everyone aboard. Johnson recommended Smith for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went up the chain of command. Within days, a correspondent from Stars and Stripes newspaper arrived at Thurley to interview the unlikely hero. His name was Andy Rooney, 23 years old, a young journalist who would later become one of the most famous broadcasters in American television history. Rooney found Smith in the barracks, the sergeant with the burned hands and the disciplinary record, and the reputation as the worst airman in the squadron.